Mississippi, 1952. The state prison, an imposing building of brick and iron, stands silent under the light of the moon, like a monument of pain and forgetfulness. It is in this place of suffering that Evelyn Carter, a black woman in her 30s, awaits the end of a fight that she never had the opportunity to fight. The damp heat of the night seems to penetrate the cell walls, heavy with the heat of thousands of past sufferings, and Evelyn remains motionless, frozen in the darkness. The buzzing of the insects outside seems to mingle with the beating of his heart, each beat an additional pain in his chest. She is alone, although the solitude of the cell is not only physical. It is the isolation of a woman sentenced to death for a crime she never committed, a crime that no evidence, no testimony, nothing has ever corroborated. However, tomorrow, at dawn, she will be executed. The electric chair waits, its shadow creeping into the dark corners of his thoughts. The memory of the sentence still resonates in her, like a distant clap of thunder that has never ceased to erupt in her mind. Evelyn closes her eyes for a moment, feeling the heaviness of the air, and her mind drifts to the past, to that disastrous day when everything changed. On Sunday afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the small town of Jackson in a suffocating heat. She came home from work quietly, her steps tired but imbued with the reassuring familiarity of her modest daily life. A waitress at a local restaurant, Evelyn lived an unpretentious life, making do with what she had. There was no fear of tomorrow. She had always believed that her skin color would not hinder her simple dreams and desires for a quiet life. But that day, that illusion was shattered. As she arrived in front of her house, a dull sound of engines tore through the tranquility of the afternoon. Men in uniform appeared, as if from nowhere, their attitude full of cruel certainty. They hadn't even bothered to warn him, to explain to him why they were there. Their only language was that of brutal authority and unfounded accusations. "Hands up, Carter." "Not a move," one of the police officers had ordered, his voice as hard as a hammer. The words rang in his ears like a whiplash. She hadn't had time to understand. She didn't have time to defend herself. She just threw her hands up, wondering if, somehow, this was all a mistake. But the police weren't looking for an answer. They were looking for a culprit, and she was chosen. His mother, Esther, had emerged from the porch, her hands trembling, her eyes filled with terror and confusion. The scene was too fast, too chaotic for Evelyn to fully grasp it. She saw her mother again, fighting against helplessness, shouting her name, calling for reason. But reason no longer had any place here. The scene was written in advance. The men in uniform were the masters of the game, and Evelyn was just a piece, a pawn to be moved as they pleased. "What are you doing? What did my daughter do?" Esther had pleaded, her voice trembling, broken with uncertainty. "She knows very well what she did," one of the police officers had replied with icy contempt, his accusing gaze fixing Evelyn like a criminal. Then, without further ado, they seized her and took her away. She remembers the pain of the policeman's hand on her arm, the humiliation of being treated like a guilty person even before a court gets involved. His thoughts raced, searching for an explanation, a reason, but none came. The cries of his little brother, Henry, rang in his ears, his childish voice pleading. "Evelyn. No. Leave her alone." "Shut up, kid," one of the police officers had growled before hitting him with the rifle but on the shoulder, his brutal gesture marking Henry's flesh like a new humiliation in this scene of abjection. The young boy's cry, muffled by pain and incomprehension, still resonated in Evelyn's mind, long after the police car had driven away. The scene unfolded slowly, almost like a bad dream, a parallel reality where violence and cruelty occurred without explanation, without reason. The next moment the door slammed behind her, and Evelyn watched helplessly as the silhouette of her mother, of Henry, receded, swallowed by a cloud of dust, as if her life itself were dissolving in the hot Mississippi air. It was no longer her family she saw, but a brutal farewell, a final look back towards a world she already knew was lost. In the sheriff's office, there was no room for explanations, no room for humanity, no room for the truth. Evelyn was a monster, a culprit, and her skin color was the only prejudice needed to decide her fate. They hadn't even asked her where she was that night. They had not given him time to defend his innocence. The legal process was only a formality to close a case that had already been decided. She stood there, a designated prey, a woman condemned in advance, under the eyes of a sheriff who had never looked at her as a person, but as an object of contempt to be condemned. The prosecution's witnesses were white men, the same men who had always seen in Evelyn's skin the mark of difference, the ideal excuse for a crime they didn't even understand. These men, known for their visceral hatred towards black people, had claimed to have seen her leave William Hargrove's house on the evening of the murder, without the slightest supporting evidence. Their testimonies were lies woven with racism, baseless stories that had only one purpose: to make her disappear. And the proof that would seal his fate? A black scarf. A simple piece of cloth, found near Hargrove's body. Their accusations were as flimsy as spider threads, but no one wanted to hear the truth. He had been told that this scarf was his. As if the color of the fabric could link a human being to a crime he did not commit. The fact that she had never set foot in Hargrove's house, that no one had seen her there, was of no concern to anyone. The fact that she wasn't even allowed to shed a single tear when thinking about the brutality of the system that imprisoned her didn't matter to anyone. What mattered was that she was black, and in racist, segregationist Mississippi, that was enough to be guilty of anything. The days in prison had become an eternity, a descent into a daily hell. Every morning, she woke up with the same nagging question that tore her mind apart. Will someone come pick me up today? It was a constant mental torment, awaiting for the horror to become reality. Solitude was his most faithful companion. The guards didn't even look at her as a person. They treated her like an animal, like a creature unworthy of consideration. They passed his cell, sneering among themselves, uttering insults so violent that they lost their meaning over time. But she still heard them, these poisonous words. They still hit her, but without the physical touch. They were content to make her feel invisible, insignificant, as if her suffering was only the reflection of a just and deserved condemnation. There was only one person who still came to visit him, Reverend Elijah Green. A man of God, a believing soul, who, against all odds, still believed in his innocence. It was the only ray of light in this prison of darkness. The only face that saw her not as guilty, but as a woman worthy of compassion and justice. And that evening which marked the last visit before the inevitable, he had come one last time. The Reverend placed a hand, gentle and comforting, through the bars. Evelyn felt the warmth of that hand as a last link with humanity, a last thread of connection with a world outside, a world she would soon leave. She slowly turned her gaze towards him, a sad smile touching her lips. "My daughter, I want you to know one thing," he began, his voice breaking with emotion. He paused for a moment, as if every word he was about to say carried the weight of everything that had happened, everything he had seen. Then, with infinite gentleness, he added, "Tomorrow, whatever happens, you will not die alone." Evelyn smiled softly, a sad, tired smile. This smile was the recognition of a sacrifice, of an inevitable end, but also of a final hope, that of having been heard, of having been loved, despite everything. "I'm already dead, Reverend," she whispered. "I died the day they took me from my family." He closed his eyes, praying silently, before leaving, his shoulders heavy with sadness. This moment of prayer, silent and deep, seemed suspended in time, a last act of faith before the end. Reverend Elijah Green knew that his words, his support, were not enough to stop Evelyn's tragic fate. He walked away, his heart a little heavier than before, carrying with it the weight of an irreparable injustice, of a system where the life of a black woman was worth nothing, no more than the beating of a heart that no longer seemed to have its place in this world. The day of execution finally arrived, a day that the prison awaited as a formality, an act that one carries out without thinking about it. Dawn struggled to break through the bars of Evelyn's cell. It was still dark, but the day was going to be the longest of his life, the last. Far from the hustle and bustle of the outside world, the prison seemed suspended in a dreary torpor, as if the entire universe was holding its breath. When they came to pick her up, the timid light of dawn struggled to illuminate her face, marked by months of suffering. The coldness of the chains around his wrists was the last vestige of his life, a stark reminder of the injustice that would seal his fate. They escorted her through the dark corridors, her body heavy with fatigue but her mind implacable, to the small, sinister room where the electric chair awaited her, like a metal beast ready to devour her. The journalists were already there. Their cameras crackled, their pens scratched pages. Some were already jotting down details, others were preparing to capture the fateful moment, an image of this doomed woman. To them, Evelyn was just a spectacle, an event like any other to add to the list of horrors the world had to offer. Their gaze was cold, clinical. They had come looking for a drama, a spectacle, and not a life. The governor did not deign to grant a pardon, preferring to seal the fate of a black woman in a Mississippi riddled with racism and injustice. His death was not an act of justice, but a formality, a piece of the puzzle that had to be put together to keep the system in place. She was tied to the chair. The cold metal of his late instrument caressed his skin with disgusting insistence. The electrodes were attached to his ankles, to his skull. The contact of the metal on his skin seemed to make the air thicker, heavier, as if the entire universe was holding its breath waiting for the end. The executioner checked the connections one last time. He nodded, indicating that he was ready. The prison director then approached, looking serious, as if this moment was the only one he had really experienced in his life. "Evelyn Carter, do you have any last words?" he asked in a monotone voice. Eyes turned towards her, like vultures watching for already marked prey. But Evelyn didn't see them. His gaze was calm, almost serene. She looked up slowly, meeting those who condemned her. There was an incredible strength in his eyes, an inflexible courage, more powerful than all the insults that had been thrown at him, more powerful than the system that had crushed her. There was a light in his eyes, an indestructible flame, that of the human soul. She wasn't afraid. She knew. She knew that what she was going to say would be her last act of rebellion, her last breath of dignity in the face of the injustice around her. She spoke. "May God open your eyes, before it is too late." A shudder ran through the room. Evelyn's words were like a sharp blade, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. They were a challenge, a call to the conscience of those who were there, a last sliver of truth before it all ended. But before anyone could react, a roar of thunder tore through the sky outside. The prison seemed to shake under the violence of the explosion which shook the building. A transformer had exploded, sending waves of fear throughout the structure. Darkness fell suddenly. The lights flickered, before going out. Chaos ensued immediately. The screams mixed with panic. The prison, until then a well-oiled machine, seemed paralyzed, frozen in the moment. The director turned pale, his face pale with anguish. He seemed to no longer know where to stand, where to look. It was as if the whole world had just collapsed around him. "Damn," he whispered. A heavy silence fell over the room. Nobody knew what had just happened. Was it a simple accident, a coincidence, or a sign? A sign sent by a superior force, a divine manifestation that played with destiny, an invisible hand coming to interrupt the execution, with a last breath of hope. Everything seemed suspended in expectation, and no one dared to move, as if everyone was waiting for the answer. Then, in this confusion, one of the guards stood up. He was trembling, visibly overwhelmed by what he was about to reveal. His voice was low, almost inaudible, but it struck the room like another clap of thunder. I can't keep this to myself anymore." All eyes turned towards him. He was shaking, fear visible in his eyes. He was caught in an inner struggle, between loyalty to his work, to his duty, and the truth that was eating away at him. He stood there, looking at Evelyn, guilt crushing his shoulders. "I lied. I hid a report. There were prints on the murder weapon. They weren't Evelyn Carter's." The sky erupted with another clap of thunder, as if to underline the shattering revelation that had just been made. The director turned pale. His face turned livid at the truth that poured into the room like a flooded river. The journalists, taken by surprise, rushed for the information. Camera flashes lit up the room, capturing the scene, trying to capture the moment when everything changed. Those who witnessed this moment would tell another story, a story that the whole world would know. Evelyn, still tied to the chair, did not move. She was there, firmly anchored in her truth, her gaze fixed on the guard who had just broken her silence. She knew. She had always known that the injustice inflicted on her was only an illusion, a cruel game played by those who believed themselves to be all-powerful. She had always known that one day the truth would come out, like a cry in the night. But she had never hoped for this moment. She never wanted to be a hero. She was just a woman, a mother, an innocent person, crushed by a system that had condemned her. Yet, that day she would become something more. Something bigger than anything she could have imagined. That evening the execution was suspended. The roar of the explosion, the unexpected interruption of the electricity, all this chaos seemed like a twist of fate, a sign. But what followed, what unfolded in the hours that followed, exceeded all expectations. A scandal broke out, devastating and inevitable, throughout the country. The media, eager for revelations, went wild. Prominent lawyers stood up, some voluntarily, others driven by a sense of morality and a desire for justice. Activists, long familiar with the fight for equality, began to organize demonstrations, making their voices heard in the streets and in front of institutions. Their words resonated like an echo of revolt, denouncing racial injustice, the failures of the judicial system and the corruption of the authorities. Even senators joined the fray, demanding an official investigation and calling for transparency in the judicial process. Calls for justice, for the truth, for a review of the Evelyn Carter trial were everywhere, shaking up the tranquility of institutions. The entire country seemed to react, like a body spasming following a violent shock. 48 hours later, an official judgment came. Evelyn Carter was exonerated. The innocence that had been denied him for so many years, the recognition of a truth that everyone had ignored, was now a reality. The news spread like a shockwave. The press, at first so eager to condemn her, turned around, capturing every detail of the announcement, every word of the verdict. The newspapers ran headlines. The television channels interrupted their programs to broadcast the event live. Evelyn was finally free. The country, which had rejected and wrongly condemned it, was forced to admit its grave error. When the prison door opened to release her, the daylight seemed softer, as if the universe itself had held its breath waiting for this moment. The crowd was there, massed behind the gates, shouting his name, raising their arms, brandishing signs and banners. People came from everywhere. Families, young activists, former prisoners, neighbors, strangers. To them, Evelyn was more than just a victim. She embodied resilience, hope and the fight against injustice. But in the midst of this excitement, it was his family who had their place first. Her mother, her face marked by years of anguish, hope and pain, threw herself into his arms as soon as she saw her, tears rolling down her cheeks, her body racked with sobs. This scene, like a moment suspended in time, marked the end of a nightmare and the beginning of a new reality. Evelyn's son Henry, now a teenager, ran towards her. He was no longer the child he once was, but the years without her had made him mature too quickly. He threw himself into her arms, not finding words strong enough to express what he felt. He had grown up without her, without fully understanding the weight of what she had suffered. But today everything seemed different. Today, he found his mother, her soul resplendent, even after everything she had been through. He was living proof of her love and resilience. Reverend Green, still there, faithful, stood a little behind, but he couldn't help but let the tears flow. He approached Evelyn, taking her in his arms, whispering with almost sacred sweetness, "You are a miracle, Evelyn." The words, although full of tenderness and admiration, resonated like gentle irony. Evelyn didn't respond. She did not seek to dispel them, nor to deny this idea. But in that moment, she knew something he didn't yet know. She looked up at the sky, a sad smile on her lips. His eyes, marked by the suffering and wisdom of years of struggle, seemed to search for something beyond this scene, beyond the crowd and the cheers. She was not a miracle. No, it was not divine intervention or a miraculous rescue. She was a woman. A woman who had survived. And more than anything, she had faced, with courage and dignity, everything that had been done to her. It was not a miracle. It was a proof of human strength, of the ability to endure and resist, even when all seemed lost. She was not a miracle. She was a survivor. And this truth, this deep and silent knowledge, made it more powerful than anything anyone could have imagined. She didn't need to be saved. She had saved herself. Through her resilience, through her silence, through her dignity, she had become more than just a victim. She had become a symbol of rediscovered innocence, of late justice, but also of the inability of oppression to destroy the human spirit. And now no one could ever erase it. Nothing and no one could erase the history she carried within her, nor the truth that followed her like a faithful shadow. She was alive, she was present, and nothing would ever have the power to silence her. She had survived hell, and when she left this prison, she was no longer a simple woman. She had become an unalterable being, a living testimony to everything that had been broken and everything that could still be repaired.